Picture a room that costs more than most people earn in a year. Fill it with silk wallpaper and a mahogany four-poster bed with curtains heavy enough to block out the sun entirely. A fireplace burning even in August, a basin of rose water on the dressing table, and a smell underneath all of that, underneath the lavender and the coal smoke and the rose petals floating in the bowl, a smell that no amount of money quite manages to bury. Milk and blood and lanolin, and the particular sweetness of a wound that hasn't yet decided whether it intends to heal or to fester. That's 1862. That's a lying-in room in a terraced house in Kensington, London. A room where women spend the most dangerous weeks of their lives surrounded by every luxury their husbands can afford, watched over by doctors who have never fed a child in their lives, given advice by nurses who mean well and are wrong about almost everything, and left completely, profoundly, silently alone in the part that matters most. Add glass instruments that look like they were designed for a laboratory. Add lead poultices the colour of pewter pressed against skin so tender that even the brush of a nightgown causes tears. Add a baby who has been screaming for 4 hours and won't latch, and a husband pacing downstairs who believes the solution is simply to try harder, and a doctor on his way who will say things with such confidence and such total wrongness that they will haunt you for the rest of your life. That's where we're going tonight. Not as a history lesson, not as a catalogue of strange Victorian customs that you can shake your head at from a comfortable distance. We're going inside it. We're living it. We're feeling what it felt like to be a woman in that room, in that body, in that era, with a hungry infant and cracked nipples and a medical establishment that was absolutely certain it knew best and was absolutely catastrophically mistaken. I make these stories, and I know full well that some of you are listening to fall asleep, which is maybe the darkest irony possible, given that sleep is the one thing new mothers never get. But you're here, and I'm here, and we're doing this. Get comfortable. Here we go. Your eyes are open before you're fully awake. That's the first thing you learn after a birth. You don't wake the way you used to wake, slowly and pleasantly, surfacing from dreams like something swimming upward through warm water. Now consciousness arrives all at once, sharp and immediate, called up by a sound so specific and so urgent that your body responds before your mind does. The sound is your daughter. She's in the wooden cradle not 4 feet from the bed, and she has been making this sound, not crying exactly, something more sustained and more desperate than crying, a sound like a small machine with no off switch. For what feels like hours but might be 20 minutes, you genuinely cannot tell anymore. Time has become strange since the birth. It pools in some places and vanishes in others. It is, the clock on the mantelpiece tells you, 10 minutes past 2 in the morning. Your body tells you other things. Your breasts tell you first, because they always do now. They've been telling you things for 3 days, loudly, insistently, in a language made entirely of pressure and heat. They're engorged. That's the word the monthly nurse uses, said with the particular clipped efficiency she brings to all medical descriptions, as though making it clinical makes it less alarming. Engorged. As though your body has simply made a clerical error of volume and needs correcting. What it actually feels like is this. Someone has replaced your chest with 2 spheres of hot stone wrapped in skin that has stretched to a point where stretching further seems geometrically impossible. The skin is shiny. It is that tight. When you move, the weight shifts, and the shift sends something between pain and an almost pain radiating outward to your collarbone and down to your ribs and up into your armpits where the milk ducts run, apparently. Though no one explained that part to you before. No one explained most of it to you before. Your right nipple is cracked. You discovered this yesterday afternoon, when the monthly nurse pressed little Eleanor to your breast with the brisk certainty of a woman who has done this 500 times and knows it will work eventually, and Eleanor latched, and you made a sound that brought your husband running from his study 2 floors below. Not a scream. Something worse than a scream. A sound you had no idea you could produce. Low and shocked and involuntary. The sound of your body registering something it was not prepared for. The crack runs across the nipple at an angle. It's small, maybe 3/4 of an inch. You could cover it with the nail of your little finger. It bleeds. You know it bleeds because when Eleanor pulled away from the breast yesterday, her mouth was pink, not with the residue of milk. The other colour. Your colour. She swallowed some of it. You didn't tell anyone. You didn't know whether you were supposed to tell anyone. You still don't know. You sit up now, slowly, because sitting up quickly is still not something your body does without complaint. The lying in has been 3 days. The monthly nurse tells you this is nothing. Tells you women used to stay in bed for a month. Tells you of a time, not so long ago, when getting out of bed at 3 days postpartum would have been considered reckless, bordering on sinful. You're grateful she can't see your face when she says these things, because what your face does is not polite. The fire has burned low. In August, even in August, the fireplace is kept lit. The room must be kept warm. The room must be kept still. No drafts, no cold air, no visitors except those the doctor permits. The windows are shut and will remain shut. The smell of the room comes at you as you shift to the edge of the bed. You've stopped noticing it for hours at a stretch, and then it returns, always when you move, when the disturbed air carries it fresh to your nose. Milk. The milk that has leaked through the flannel pads pinned inside your nightgown, and beneath it the lingering iron of the birth itself, though the nurse has changed the sheets twice and burned something fragrant in the fireplace to cover it. And below that, faintly, something sweet and slightly wrong. The smell your right breast has been producing for the last day, a smell you have been telling yourself is nothing, and which some part of you knows is not nothing at all. Eleanor is still crying. You cross the room in your bare feet, and the cold of the floorboards shocks upward through your soles. The fire only warms so much, and the heat rises, and by the time it gets to the floor it's gone. And you reach into the cradle and lift your daughter, and she is so small that the lifting of her still surprises you. 3 days in, and you still expect her to weigh more. She weighs 7 pounds and 6 ounces. She has your husband's ears, which you are choosing to find charming. She has your mother's hair, which is to say almost none at all. She has an expression of permanent outraged disbelief that the midwife called a spirited temperament, and that you've begun to suspect simply means you're in trouble. You lower yourself into the chair by the fire with her held against your chest, and you begin the process that has consumed every hour of the last 3 days, and the process is this. You try. You try to feed your daughter. Let me tell you what they told you to expect. Let me tell you what the books said. The books your mother sent from Hampshire. The books your husband's mother selected with great care. The books that line the shelf above the dressing table in their good blue bindings. They said this would be natural. They said, and they used this word with a confidence that now seems almost aggressive, they said this would be instinctive. The baby knows what to do. The mother's body knows what to do. The two of them will find each other, and it will work because it is designed to work, because it is, in the language of 1862, God's own plan for the nourishment of infants. Your daughter does not know what to do. Your body does not know what to do. Or rather, and this is the thing that will take you weeks to fully understand, your body knows exactly what to do, and is doing it with alarming vigour, producing milk in volumes that seem to bear no relationship to your daughter's ability to receive it. And the mismatch between supply and demand is precisely the problem, and nobody quite explains it that way, because nobody in 1862 quite understands it that way either. What they understand is that something is wrong. They just disagree, with great confidence and tremendous specificity about what. Eleanor roots against your chest. Her mouth opens and closes. She's hungry. She is absolutely, demonstrably hungry. This child who arrived into the world 3 days ago and has been making her desires known with a clarity that would be admirable in other circumstances. She is hungry, and you have milk. You have, if anything, too much milk, the excess of which has been soaking through your nightgown for the last 12 hours. And yet, you position her the way the monthly nurse showed you, the way the midwife demonstrated before she left, the way your mother's letter describes in carefully euphemistic language that somehow manages to explain very little while taking up considerable space on the page. You bring Eleanor's mouth to your nipple and she latches and you brace yourself, and for one brief moment, maybe 4 seconds, 5, it seems to be working. She is drawing. You can feel the pull, and then she pulls away, and her face crumples into the specific configuration that means the screaming is about to begin again. You look down at your right breast. The crack has reopened. The fire pops. Outside, London at 2 a.m. makes its London sounds. The occasional clatter of hooves on cobblestones, a dog somewhere, the distant rattle of a cart, the city never fully silent even at this hour. And your daughter begins again to make her sound, and you sit in the chair and breathe and do not cry, because crying will wake your husband, and your husband will call for the monthly nurse, and the monthly nurse will do the thing with the glass pump, and you're not ready for the glass pump again tonight. Let me tell you about the glass pump. It exists because Victorian medicine understands correctly that milk must keep moving or problems occur. What it does not understand, what it will not understand for decades, is that the relationship between supply and demand is governed by mechanisms more complex than simple extraction. The pump is a glass vessel, roughly the shape and size of a small pear, with a fitted mouth that presses against the breast and a bulb at the opposite end that, when squeezed and released, creates a suction. The principle is sound. The application in practice is a different matter. The glass is cold. Not lukewarm, not slightly cool, but cold in the way glass always is. Cold that comes up through the thin nightgown before the thing even touches skin. The monthly nurse warms it by the fire first, because she is a sensible woman who has done this enough times to know the alternative, and even warmed, the moment it meets broken skin, what you feel is, there's no gentler word, acute. The suction catches the cracked tissue and pulls it, and the pulling is the thing that the books do not prepare you for. Not the fact of the discomfort, but the quality of it. The way it is both mechanical and intimate, the way your body tries to respond to it as it responds to feeding, and the confusion of those signals produces something your nervous system files under the general category of wrong. You survive it. Most women survive it. But you understand, sitting in this chair at 10 minutes past 2 on a Thursday morning in August 1862, why some women choose not to survive it, and simply stop. Simply put down the pump and the compressors and the instruction books and say, enough. I cannot. I will not. The ones who say this will be judged for it. You know that already. You've known it since before Eleanor was born. Known it the way women in your position know all the rules of your position, by absorption rather than instruction, by the particular quality of silence that surrounds certain subjects. The good mother breastfeeds. The devoted mother breastfeeds. The woman who cannot or will not breastfeed, who fails at this most natural, most God-given, most fundamentally female of tasks, is a subject that polite society handles with a carefully maintained silence that somehow manages to communicate everything while saying nothing at all. You are a doctor's wife. Your husband's name is Charles, and he is a good man, and he is pacing downstairs at this moment because the sound of Eleanor crying carries through the floor, and he cannot sleep and he cannot help, and the combination is making him agitated in a way that expresses itself as concern about your methodology. He has already suggested twice in the last 2 days that you ask the monthly nurse to supplement with the boat. The boat is a vessel shaped like a small gondola with a spout at one end, filled with panned cow's milk diluted with water and sweetened with a little sugar. The boat represents, in your husband's mind, a reasonable solution. What your husband does not know, what he has no particular reason to know, being a man in 1862 with a medical degree from Edinburgh and a practice in Kensington, is that the boat is nearly as likely to kill Eleanor as to save her, that the milk in the boat will sour, that the spout of the boat cannot be adequately cleaned, that infants fed by the boat in this city, in this decade, die at rates that would horrify him if they were published anywhere that respectable men read, which they are not, because the deaths of infants are recorded and quickly buried and quickly forgotten, absorbed into the vast statistical fog of childhood mortality that the Victorians have simply decided to accept as the cost of existing in the world. You know this because you have read. You have read more than most women in your position read, more than the monthly nurse thinks appropriate, more than your mother-in-law would recommend. You have read Mrs. Beeton, who is wrong about several things but not about this. You have read the reports from the Foundling Hospital. You have read, in your husband's medical journals, which he leaves in the morning room and which you pick up when he's not looking, papers by men who've studied infant mortality rates with the careful patience of men who believe in numbers. The numbers are not good. Your daughter is hungry right now at 2:10 in the morning, and you cannot feed her, not successfully, not without pain that makes your vision white at the edges, and the alternative you know about will kill her if you're unlucky, and the alternative your husband knows about. The wet nurse, the woman he suggested 3 days ago, and whom you refused with more sharpness than you intended, presents its own particular horror. Eleanor cries. You try again. The left breast is less damaged. The milk comes more easily from the left. Eleanor latches and you count. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then she pulls away again, and you look at her face and try to understand what's wrong with the angle or the hold or the position or you yourself, and understanding is not coming. It's nearly 2:30 now. This is what nobody told you about. Not the pain, specifically. You were warned about pain in the vague, non-specific way that Victorians warn women about everything, which is to say you were told it would be uncomfortable at first, and to persevere, and that it would improve with time and patience. You were warned. But what nobody warned you about was the isolation of it, the particular aloneness of this chair at 2:30 in the morning, with your husband asleep downstairs and the monthly nurse in her room at the end of the corridor and your daughter inconsolable in your arms, and no one on earth who can do this for you. No one who can take the specific weight of this specific problem from your specific body. That isolation is the thing. That isolation is what nobody talks about. In the morning, or what passes for morning in the lying-in room, which is to say when the light changes to grey behind the heavy curtains, and the sounds of the street shift from their nighttime register to their daytime one. The monthly nurse comes in with her basin and her clean linens and the glass pump wrapped in flannel, and she assesses the situation with the brisk competence that you have simultaneously grown to rely on and to resent. She looks at your breast. She makes a small sound that is not quite concern and not quite satisfaction. She says your milk is coming in well. She says this as though it is unambiguously good news, which it should be, which it is. You understand that it is, except that well apparently means with excess, with pressure, with engorgement that has now hardened the upper outer quadrant of your right breast into something that feels, when she presses it with practiced fingers, like bread dough that hasn't been worked. Cord, she says, not to you specifically, to the situation. A cord is what they call it when the milk backs up in a duct and the tissue hardens around it. In another time, in another language, you would call it a blocked duct. In 1862, you call it a cord, and the treatment is warmth and pressure and the pump. And if those don't work, if the cord persists, if the tissue grows hot and swollen beyond the warmth of simple engorgement, if the smell changes, then you call for the doctor, and the doctor brings instruments that make the pump look friendly. She applies the flannel wrung out in hot water first, presses it against your breast with steady hands, and holds it there for what feels like a very long time and is probably 4 minutes. You breathe. Eleanor has been fed by the nurse from a spoon, actual cow's milk mixed with water and administered by spoon, not the boat, because you asked and the nurse, to her credit, agreed. And she is sleeping now in that deep newborn way that looks like unconsciousness and smells like milk and warmth. She is alive and fed and sleeping. This is what you have right now. This is enough. The flannel comes away. The nurse picks up the pump. You have learned in the last 3 days to breathe a particular way when the pump is applied. Slow, through the nose. Something your body discovered almost on its own, the way it discovered certain things about the birth, found the rhythm that made it marginally more survivable. In through the nose to a slow count, out through the mouth. Let the shoulders drop. Let the hands relax on the arms of the chair. Do not grip. Gripping makes everything worse. The glass meets your skin, even warmed, even flannel wrapped until the last moment. It is still glass, still carrying the memory of coolness, and your skin, stretched and sensitized and cracked in one precise location, registers the contact with a flinching that you've learned to suppress because flinching disrupts the seal, and disrupting the seal means starting over. The pump requires squeezing. The monthly nurse operates it with practiced efficiency, squeezing the bulb at intervals, building and releasing suction in a rhythm that your body does not understand as natural, and your mind cannot quite convince your body to accept. The first extraction of milk is always the strangest, not the most painful. That distinction belongs to the moment just before the cracked tissue catches, but the strangest, because there is something profoundly disorienting about watching your own body be relieved of something it produced without your conscious participation, drained by glass and mechanics in a way that is nothing like the way it was supposed to happen. The milk comes in thin streams at first, then more steadily. It is pale, almost blue-white in the morning light. The monthly nurse holds a small bowl beneath the pump, and the milk collects there, and you do not look at it after the first few times, because looking at it makes you feel something you can't quite name and don't want to examine too closely. This will be given to Eleanor later, in a spoon, or, if she'll take it, from a piece of soft cloth soaked in the milk and offered to her lips. Not from your breast. Not this morning. Perhaps not this afternoon either, because the cord needs to soften and the crack needs to heal, and the nurse has wrapped the right nipple in a compress of chamomile and lard that must stay on for as long as possible. And so today is the left side only, and the pump for what the left side cannot manage, and Eleanor getting what she can by whatever means she'll accept. This is your life now. This is the daily mathematics of feeding an infant in 1862. And this is the version for a woman with a monthly nurse and a warm room and a husband who, however unhelpful his suggestions, is not going to let her starve. There are worse versions of this story. You know there are worse versions. You will meet one of them in 3 days when the woman arrives from the agency. But we'll get to that. The pump session takes 12 minutes. You know because you've started counting. The nurse wraps your right breast back in the warm compress, pins your nightgown closed, takes the bowl of milk and tells you to sleep when you can. She says it with genuine kindness. The nurse, she is a kind woman. She's been doing this for 20 years and she knows what it costs. But she says it the way people say things that are true and useless simultaneously. Sleep when you can, as though sleeping is a thing you have any control over, as though your body and Eleanor's schedule and the ache that runs from your breast to your shoulder to your neck haven't collectively decided that sleep is something that happens in fragments of 40 minutes at unpredictable intervals, like letters arriving from a very unreliable correspondent. You sleep, you wake up, Eleanor cries, you begin again. Let me tell you something about what was happening to women's bodies in 1862 that nobody was saying out loud. The corset was killing them, not metaphorically, not in the abstract way that restrictive dress kills women's freedom or ambitions. Literally, in some cases directly, through a mechanism as simple and brutal as this. When you lace a corset around a body that is producing milk, and you pull the laces to the degree that fashion and social pressure and your own internalized sense of what a respectable woman's silhouette looks like requires, when you do that, you press the external structures of the breast against the delicate ductal tissue underneath with a force that the tissue was not designed to tolerate. The milk backs up. The duct blocks. The blocked duct, left untreated or inadequately treated, becomes infected. The infection becomes an abscess. The abscess, hot, swollen, exquisitely painful, full of something that is no longer milk and not yet quite pus, requires treatment that makes every other aspect of this experience seem like mild inconvenience. You're not wearing your corset. The monthly nurse won't allow it, and your body doesn't want it, and you have enough self-preservation instinct remaining that you've hidden the corset in the wardrobe behind your summer dresses in case Charles asks. But you know, from conversations with your sister-in-law, and your mother's letters and the monthly nurse's carefully unspecific references to previous cases, that this is not universal. That there are women who lace back into their stays within days of delivery because their husbands expect it, or because they expect it of themselves, or because the alternative is feeling like they've entirely lost the person they were before, the person with a waist and a silhouette and clothes that fit, the person who existed before they became this body doing this work in this room. Those women end up back in bed, not from sentiment, from abscesses. You have a cord, which is a blocked duct, which is the beginning of the process that ends in abscesses, and you're treating it correctly with heat and the pump and rest and the nurse's careful hands, and there is a reasonable chance it resolves and you move on. But you can feel the possibility of the other outcome in the heat that hasn't quite left the upper quadrant of your right breast, in the way the compress doesn't fully ease the pressure, in the smell that comes off the wrappings when the nurse unwraps them that she has assessed and said nothing about, but that you've noticed her noticing. On the afternoon of the 4th day, she calls for your husband. Your husband, Dr. Charles Whitfield, comes up the stairs with the bearing of a man who's been called into the territory of women's medicine and is uncertain of his footing. He practices general medicine. He knows bodies. He knows fevers and fractures and the respiratory complaints that Kensington's coal smoke air produces in remarkable volume. He has delivered, in emergency, 3 infants in his career, none of them his own, all of them under conditions that were not the conditions of a good lying-in room with a monthly nurse in attendance. What he does not know, what the training at Edinburgh did not cover with any particular depth, because Edinburgh did not consider this a physician's proper domain, is this: women's bodies producing milk. He examines you. Let me tell you what this is like. It is 1862 and you're in bed, and you're his wife, and the monthly nurse stands at the window with her back to the room as a concession to your dignity, and your husband examines you with hands that are careful and warm and medically competent, and which belong to the man you have shared a bed with for 4 years, and you are a woman of your class in your era, and everything about this is not wrong precisely, but uncomfortable in a way that has nothing to do with the physical pressure of his fingers pressing your breast to map the extent of the cord. The discomfort is social, existential even. You have a body that is doing this elaborate, demanding, messy, urgent biological thing, and the doing of it is not supposed to be visible, even to your husband, even in the privacy of your own lying-in room. A good woman's body is not supposed to announce itself this way, is not supposed to leak and crack and swell and demand. You're supposed to feed your child quietly and decently with your shawl arranged over your shoulder and your expression composed and your needs minimal. Your body has not received this instruction. Charles palpates the cord. That's the word he uses. Palpates, clinical and Latin and distancing. And his face takes on the particular arrangement of features that means he's thinking rather than feeling, which is both useful and right now slightly maddening. He asks whether the warmth has increased since this morning. He asks about your temperature. He asks whether the skin has reddened beyond this quadrant. He does not ask how you are. He means to. You know he means to. But in his medical mind the how you are has subdivided into specific clinical sub-questions that seem to him more useful. I think we should have Lawson look at it, he says finally. He means his colleague, Dr. Lawson, the man who delivered Eleanor, the man who your mother-in-law recommended and who you have no reason to distrust, and 1 or 2 reasons to find slightly exhausting. Is it necessary, you ask? Probably not, Charles says, but it might be. He's being honest, which you appreciate. He could be more certain. He could say, of course, yes, necessary, call Lawson, which would relieve him of decision and relieve you of the knowledge that this is a maybe. But he chooses honest, and you love him for it. Even now, even sitting here in this nightgown with your breast wrapped in chamomile compress, and the glass pump waiting on the dressing table, and Eleanor sleeping in her cradle, with the slight wheezing sound that newborns make, that means nothing medically, and means everything to the person listening. If it's not better by tomorrow, you say. If it's not better by tomorrow, he agrees. He leaves. The nurse turns from the window. She says nothing about the conversation she absolutely overheard. She brings you a cup of beef tea which you drink because you need it, and a piece of bread and butter which you eat because Eleanor needs you to eat it, and the afternoon settles into the particular grey quiet of an August afternoon seen through closed curtains. You need to talk about the lead. Let me talk about the lead. Nipple shields in 1862 are not silicone. They are not soft, flexible discs of medical-grade material designed with millimetres of precision to allow latching while protecting damaged tissue. They are lead, or sometimes pewter, which is mostly tin with lead and other metals alloyed in. They are small caps, essentially, shaped to fit over the nipple, with a hole at the tip and a flange around the base that sits against the areola. And the baby, theoretically, ideally, in the version of this story that works, draws milk through the hole in the cap, the lead barrier protecting the cracked skin beneath from the direct mechanical force of sucking. The theory is not entirely wrong. The execution is lead. It is lead. It sits against your skin hour after hour, this small heavy weight of a metal your body slowly absorbs. The amounts are tiny, individually, in each exposure, trivial. But the skin of the breast is thin and well vascularized, and the nipple is among the most permeable tissues on the body. And the exposures are not individual, they are continuous, day after day, week after week if the cracking doesn't resolve. And the lead that isn't absorbing into you is sitting in the passage the milk passes through on its way to your daughter's mouth. Nobody in 1862 is thinking about this. Not really. There are doctors, there will be, there are already some, who have noted that lead is toxic, who have observed what painters suffer when they inhale lead dust, who have made the logical extension to lead plasters and lead compresses and lead-based cosmetics and expressed varying degrees of concern. But nipple shields are a nursing intervention, which puts them firmly in the category of women's business, which puts them firmly in the category that male physicians in 1862 feel least confident examining critically, because to examine the nursing intervention would require engaging with nursing itself, with the specific mechanics of what a breast does and how. And this is, to a significant degree, considered beneath the attention of serious medical science. The monthly nurse has the shields. She produces them from her kit with the matter-of-fact familiarity of a carpenter producing a chisel, holds one up, shows you the size, explains the application. You look at it for a long moment. It is heavier than you expected. It sits in your palm and has the specific gravity of something that is very definitely not supposed to be part of this experience. But the crack on your right nipple has gotten worse since this morning, not better, and every time Eleanor has tried to latch today she has failed and cried, and your body has failed her, and the failing, the specific texture of that failing, the way it sits in your chest entirely distinct from the physical ache, is becoming something you cannot sustain. You let the nurse apply the shield. You try again with Eleanor, and this time, this particular afternoon, in this grey August light, with the lead cap over your cracked nipple and the nurse supporting Eleanor's head from behind, it works. In the limited, qualified, imperfect way that things work in this room, in this situation, it works. Eleanor latches. Eleanor stays latched. You count past 10, past 20, past a minute, and she is feeding, and you can feel it. Can feel the pull that is now mediated and managed and not directly assaulting the broken skin. And you look down at your daughter's face and she has her eyes closed and her hand, impossibly small, impossibly complete, has found the fabric of your nightgown and is gripping it with the grip that newborns have, the unconscious, anchoring grip that means, You are what I have and I'm holding on. You do not cry. You made a decision 3 days ago not to cry in front of people, including Eleanor, because you're not sure she's old enough to distinguish tears of relief from tears of distress, and you don't want to confuse her, even though you know that is probably not how infant neurology works. You do not cry, but it is very close. Now let me tell you about the woman who arrives on the 6th day, because this is the part that sits in your chest differently from everything else, the part that has kept you company in the long hours of the night, and which you're not sure you will ever be able to speak about to anyone in a way that adequately captures what it cost her. Her name is Mary Baines. She is 23 years old. She arrived in London from a village in Derbyshire 3 years ago. She worked in domestic service until 8 months ago, at which point she became unmarried and pregnant and the household dismissed her, which is not an unusual sequence of events for 1862, and not one that Victorian society is particularly troubled by. She found lodgings in Stepney. She had her baby, a boy, she called him Thomas, 6 weeks ago, and then the money ran out. She comes recommended by the agency your husband found, the Wet Nurse Agency, the institution that exists because some women in Kensington and Mayfair and Belgravia need someone to feed their children, and other women in Stepney and Whitechapel need money badly enough to do it. When she walks in, when the nurse brings her up from downstairs and through the door of your lying-in room, your first thought is how young she looks. Not younger than you expected in terms of age, but younger in the sense of not yet fully formed, not yet inhabiting herself fully, the way very young women sometimes seem to be still discovering the outline of who they are. She is thin, not dangerously thin, not the thinness of starvation, but the thinness of someone who has not been eating quite enough for quite some time. Her hair is brown and pinned carefully up, and you can see the care she's taken with it, can see that she is trying to present herself as well as she possibly can in clothes that are clean and worn. She is nervous. She doesn't show it in her hands or in her face, but in the way she stands, very still, with the stillness of someone who has learned that moving takes up space, and taking up space invites attention. The monthly nurse introduces her, gives her name, her background, the relevant particulars. The agency has certified her, recently delivered good milk, no sign of illness, specifically no sign of syphilis, this last point being the particular obsession of the wet nurse industry in 1862, for reasons that are medically sound and implemented with a thoroughness that borders on the dehumanizing. The examination of a potential wet nurse in 1862 is not a comfortable subject. Let me tell you what it involved. Before a woman could be placed with a family, she was examined by a physician. Specifically examined. Her gums, her skin, any lesions, any rashes, the specific lesions of syphilis which were understood correctly to be transmissible through an infected woman's milk to the infant she nursed, and vice versa, infant to wet nurse, making the nursling's health as relevant to the wet nurse as the wet nurse's health to the nursling. The examination also assessed her milk, the colour, the consistency, the taste. Yes, the taste. Physicians tasted milk. This is not a metaphor. But here is what the examination did not, could not, assess with any reliability: whether Thomas was alive. Because the wet nurse's other baby, the one she left behind to come here, the one she was no longer feeding when she fed someone else's child, that was not the agency's concern. That was not formally anyone's concern. The infant abandoned to go nurse another family's child was a private matter, a domestic arrangement, something the woman presumably had handled, had arranged, had passed to a relative or a neighbour or, and this is where the thing becomes very dark very quickly, to a baby farmer, Baby farmers in 1862 take in infants for a fee, a weekly payment, a few shillings in exchange for care. Some of them provide genuine care. Some of them do not. Some of them, and this is documented, prosecuted, horrifying in its plainness, simply don't feed the infants, or feed them gin and water, or arrange their bedding in ways that make survival unlikely. Because an infant who dies costs no more to bury than one who lives costs to feed. And the fee from the mother has already been collected, and the mother is across the city or across the country, doing work that pays for the fee, and nobody is checking. You know some of this. You've read. You've heard enough, in the careful way that women of your class hear things they're not supposed to know, to have assembled the outline of it. You look at Mary Baines standing in your room, and you don't know whether Thomas is alive. You ask her, which is perhaps not what you are supposed to do, not the done thing, not how the arrangement is meant to work. The monthly nurse's expression tells you it's not the done thing, but you ask. "My baby," Mary says. Her voice is steady. "My aunt has him. In Hackney. She has children of her own. She'll look after him." The steadiness of her voice when she says it is either the steadiness of someone who believes what they're saying, or the steadiness of someone who has decided to believe it because the alternative is something they cannot afford to consider. You look at her face and cannot tell which. You nod. She stays. And here is the part that you will carry with you, that will sit in the architecture of this experience long after the crack has healed and the cord has resolved, and Eleanor can latch without the shield, and the pump has gone back into its case. Watching Mary Baines feed your daughter is one of the most complex experiences of your life. She does it with the ease of someone whose body and baby are in accord, the ease that you've been trying to achieve for 6 days, and which she achieves immediately, Eleanor latching and staying latched and feeding properly for the first time with no pain and no shields and no pump, and the relief you feel is real and immediate and real, and underneath it, running alongside it like a different frequency of the same note, is something else. Mary looks at Eleanor while she feeds her, looks at her the way she looks at something she recognises. Her body knows what to do with a hungry newborn. Her body has been doing it. And the baby she's been doing it with is 6 weeks old and is in Hackney with her aunt. And whether her aunt is the kind of aunt who will keep a 6-week-old fed and alive until Mary earns enough to reclaim him, or whether the arrangement unravels in some way that cannot be undone, you don't know. And Mary doesn't know, and the knowledge of the not knowing is in her face every time she isn't looking at Eleanor. When she looks at Eleanor, she is somewhere else, in a room in Hackney in her mind, and you see it. You see it. You don't say anything. What would you say? You've hired her. You need her. Eleanor needs her. The alternative, the pump and the shield and the cord that keeps threatening to become something worse, is still real, is still happening in the background. You're not in a position to be sentimental, but you see it. Let me tell you what happened to wet nurses in the Victorian era, because this is not a small story and it does not live only in your lying-in room. The wet nurse system in 1862 is so thoroughly woven into the fabric of upper and middle-class infant care that it seems, from inside it, simply natural. Of course, wealthy women don't breastfeed. Of course, they hire women who do. Of course, those women come from the class of women who have no choice but to provide their bodies for hire, because the alternatives are worse. This is simply the way things are, and the way things are is not a sentence that any society finds it comfortable to examine too closely. But here are some of the things that are simply the way things are. Wet nurses in 1862 earn approximately 7 to 12 shillings a week. In a household like yours, plus room and board. This is more than most women of Mary's background can earn in domestic service, which is why they do it. It is also, not coincidentally, more than it costs to send Thomas to a baby farmer in Hackney, which is why the math of the situation looks, from the outside, like it might almost work. Wet nurses are expected to follow dietary rules, to avoid alcohol, though this is honoured largely in the breach because alcohol is present in beer, and beer is drunk by everyone in 1862, as a matter of daily survival given the quality of London's water, and the wet nurse's ale ration is typically included in the household's food budget, and is not withheld unless she gives specific cause. They are expected to avoid excitement, to avoid anxiety, to avoid strong emotions of any kind, because the Victorian understanding of how emotions affect milk is extensive and largely incorrect. The theory, and it is held with the absolute conviction of people who have not tested it and never will, is that emotional disturbance passes directly into a woman's milk, and from there into the nursing infant's character and constitution. Fear makes the milk fearful. Anger makes the milk choleric. Grief, and this is the one that sits most heavily in your mind when you look at Mary. Grief makes the milk melancholic. The melancholy of a grieving mother, ingested in milk by an innocent infant, is considered sufficient to explain all manner of infant ailments and behavioural disturbances. So the wet nurse is not supposed to grieve. She is not supposed to grieve for Thomas. She is expected to present a calm, cheerful, equable, emotional surface, appropriate to a woman whose body is being used for its milk and whose interior life is not, in this arrangement, the household's concern. Mary presents a calm, cheerful, equable emotional surface. You watch her do it every day. The careful management of her face, the smile she assembles when the nurse comes to check on the feeding, the composure she maintains in your presence. And every few days when the arrangement is working well enough that Charles has stopped hovering, and the nurse has her routine and Eleanor is gaining weight at the rate the book suggests she should, every few days, when she thinks no one is watching, you see Mary's face do something else entirely. Something private and necessary and absolutely real. You've never said anything about it. You wonder sometimes what she would do if you did. On the 9th day, you receive a letter from the agency reminding you of the schedule of examinations for the wet nurse. Monthly nurse means quarterly examination of her milk, and a monthly health check, the syphilis question. The ongoing management of her as a resource rather than a person. You read it and put it in the drawer of the dressing table and don't tell Mary about it, though she already knows, because she has done this before. This is not her first household. You don't know that on the 9th day. You find it out later, by accident, overhearing her conversation with the nurse in the corridor. This is not her first. She's been a wet nurse twice before. Both times she left a baby behind. Both times she came back to find a baby who was smaller, thinner, less robust than the one she'd left. Both times the baby survived. Both times it cost her something she hasn't named to anyone and won't. She is 23 years old, and she is on her 3rd household, and her 3rd abandoned infant. And she has learned to maintain the equable surface, and she is managing it so successfully that the nurse thinks she's a good sort, very settled, not prone to difficulties, and your husband finds her quite satisfactory. And you who have been watching, you see the edge of what it's costing every time she looks at Eleanor and is somewhere else. You are going to heal. Your crack is healing. The cord is resolving slowly, imperfectly, with the help of the heat compresses and the reduced load on the right breast while Mary manages most of Eleanor's feeds. In another week you will be able to take over the majority of the feeding yourself, the shield discarded, the pump relegated to emergency use, your body and Eleanor's finally finding the coordination they failed to find in those first 6 days. Mary will go back to the agency. Thomas will come back from Hackney thin and small and alive, which is the best possible version of this outcome, the version that in 1862 you have no particular right to expect, and he will be thin and small and alive, and Mary will look at him with an expression that her face doesn't know how to contain. But that is later. Right now it is the 9th day, and Eleanor is gaining weight, and your breast is healing, and somewhere in the middle distance of your recovery, the shape of what happened to Mary is becoming visible to you in a way that is not comfortable, and cannot be made comfortable, and perhaps should not be. Let's talk about what happens when it goes wrong. Let me take you to another room, another house, another woman in another version of this same story, because the Victorian breastfeeding experience is not one story, and the lying-in room in Kensington is not the worst room in it. The worst rooms are further east, are smaller, are colder, are occupied by women who do not have monthly nurses or glass pumps, or the money to call Dr. Lawson if the cord doesn't resolve, and whose bodies are doing the same thing your body is doing but without any of the infrastructure that makes it survivable. Her name, in this other room, is Ellen Marsh. She's 27 years old and she lives in 3 rooms in Bermondsey with her husband Samuel, who works in the tanneries, and their 2 surviving children, a girl of 5 and a boy of 3. And now the new baby, a boy they've called Arthur, who arrived 6 days ago after a labour that took 2 days, and was managed by a neighbour woman who has delivered most of the babies on this street, and who charges a shilling where a proper midwife would charge 5. Ellen's room is, let me give you this room in the specificity it deserves. The walls are damp. Not occasionally, not seasonally, but permanently, wetly, visibly damp, with a bloom of dark on the plaster in the corner above the bed that has been there for years and will be there when they leave and was there when they arrived. The ceiling is low enough that Samuel, who's not a tall man, has to remember to duck when he crosses the room. The window is small and faces a narrow court, and what light it admits comes in grudgingly and doesn't stay. The smell in Ellen's room is the smell of the tanneries 2 streets away, the hides soaking in urine and oak bark, the lime pits, the specific heavy animal smell of leather being made from something that was recently alive. And over that the smell of the room itself, 3 people sleeping in one bed and cooking on a small grate, and the baby's napkins drying on a line strung between the window and the hook on the opposite wall, and under all of that the same smell your room has, the milk smell, the blood smell, the iron and sweetness of a very new baby. Ellen cannot call a doctor, not because she doesn't know one. There are doctors who come to Bermondsey, dispensary doctors, poor law doctors, men who are not entirely cynical about what they do, but because the doctor costs money, and the money is the thing they're always just behind on. Samuel's wages from the tannery are 17 shillings a week, which is not terrible wages for 1862, and the rent is 3 shillings and 6pence, and coal and food, and the shilling the neighbour woman charged, and the cost of the children's boots, which wore out in April and haven't been replaced yet. There is no money for the doctor unless someone is dying. She is not yet dying. She has a fever. Not the fever of the birth, which is a different fever and a much more dangerous one, The fever that kills women in the days immediately after delivery at rates that would seem impossible to accept if you thought about them too hard. She came through that. This is a different fever, arrived on the 5th day, settling in her right breast, announcing its presence with heat and redness that has spread from the nipple upward and outward and has now involved most of the upper half of the breast in a tight, shiny, exquisitely tender expanse of infected tissue. Ellen has mastitis. In your room in Kensington, the cord in your breast, the blocked duct, was treated with heat, and the pump and rest and the monthly nurse's experienced hands. The cord resolved. The infection never quite established itself. You were fortunate, and you were fortunate partly because of luck, and partly because you had the nurse and the pump and the warm compresses applied at the right frequency, and the luxury of resting when you needed to. Ellen has hot water when she can heat it, and a cloth, and the 5-year-old who brings her things when she asks, and Samuel who comes home at 6 and does what he can. She has the neighbour woman who comes by when she's not occupied elsewhere. She has advice. Keep the breast warm, keep it drained, feed through the pain if you can bear it. The milk won't hurt the baby. The milk is still good, even from an infected breast. This is true and medically correct information that she has received from someone who has experienced this herself and knows. She feeds through the pain. The pain of feeding from an infected breast is a different quality from the pain of the cracked nipple. It is deeper. It comes from inside the tissue rather than from the surface of it. When Arthur latches and draws, the sensation radiates backward through the breast and deep into Ellen's armpit, and she has to grip the edge of the bed and breathe the way a woman breathes through a contraction. That same managed focus, because stopping him feeding will make it worse, and she knows that, and so she doesn't stop. But the fever is rising. On the 7th day, the neighbour woman comes and looks, and feels the heat through the skin and says, "It needs to come out." She doesn't say it gently. She doesn't preface it. Ellen knows what she means because this is not the first woman on this street who has gone through this. She has heard what comes after the abscess isn't drained, has heard about the woman on the next court who had one 4 years ago that went septic and took 2 months to kill her. 2 months. She said once she would have preferred faster. The neighbour woman goes home and comes back with a small penknife. This is not a surgical instrument. It is a penknife cleaned in hot water, held over a flame. It does the job. The neighbour woman has done this before. She holds the skin taut with one hand and makes an incision along the lower edge of the swelling, and what comes out, the hot, relieving, terrible outflow of a drained abscess, is not something Ellen will describe to anyone afterward in specific terms. What she will say is that it felt like a stone lifted off her chest. Not metaphorically. That exact sensation. The release of pressure so immediate and so total that her body gasped at it. The wound needs packing and draining and cleaning regularly for the next 2 weeks, and the neighbour woman does this, and Ellen keeps feeding Arthur from the other breast while the right heals, and Samuel comes home each evening and finds his wife pale and tired and does what he can, and eventually in the version of this story that is the version that happened here, the survivable version, eventually the wound closes and heals, and Ellen is thinner than she was, and her milk has diminished on the right side, but is still present, still sufficient. And Arthur is alive and gaining weight and doesn't know, not yet, not for decades, what his birth cost. This is what happens when it goes wrong in Bermondsey. The instrument used to treat the abscess is a penknife in a small room above a tannery. You should know that. Let me take you back to your room. It's the 12th day. You're better. Genuinely, measurably better. The crack has reduced to a thin line that aches but no longer bleeds. The cord has resolved entirely under Mary's competent management of the feeding load. Your temperature has been normal for 4 days, and Dr. Lawson came yesterday and declared you doing very well, with the particular satisfaction of a man taking credit for a recovery that was largely the work of the monthly nurse and your own body's stubbornness. Eleanor is doing very well. Eleanor, in fact, is doing spectacularly, in the way of newborns who find their food source and commit to it thoroughly. She has discovered that the world contains, in addition to Eleanor herself, exactly 2 things she finds acceptable: milk and warmth. Everything else is at best tolerable. She has your mother's hair, which at 12 days is beginning to show a tendency to curl, and your husband's ears, which you have now fully committed to finding charming, and an expression of absolute concentrated determination when she latches that makes the monthly nurse laugh every time she sees it. She knows what she wants, the nurse says. She does. She knew it on day 1, and she was right. And the problem was never Eleanor's clarity about what she needed, and always the systems and instruments and social structures and medical conventions standing in the space between her need and its fulfillment. Your right nipple still wears the shield at some feedings. Not all. You've graduated to most feedings without it. The skin having toughened in the way it does when challenged repeatedly, the elasticity and resilience of tissue being one of the more remarkable things about the human body. But some. The shield sits on the dressing table between feedings, small and grey and heavy, lead catching the light in the grey particular way of metals that don't quite shine. You should throw it away. You know you should throw it away. The monthly nurse doesn't know about the lead. She thinks it's pewter, and pewter is mostly tin, so it's better, it's not nothing, but it still contains lead, and she wouldn't, if she knew, necessarily recommend stopping. There's no consensus about it in 1862. There are doctors who have written about the hazards of lead in various contexts and have not yet connected the thread to nipple shields, because the thread requires connecting the mechanics of skin absorption to infant ingestion, to developmental effects that won't be studied for another century. You're not a doctor. You're a doctor's wife in 1862, who has read more than is considered advisable for your sex and your station, and you have read enough to make you uneasy about the shield without being able to articulate the unease in terms anyone would take seriously. You keep using it for the feedings, where the alternative is pain that makes Eleanor unlatch. You think about the lead. You do not throw it away. You will throw it away in 3 weeks, when Eleanor has learned to latch consistently, and the skin has healed to the point where the shield is no longer necessary, and you will throw it away without ceremony, dropping it into the kitchen waste and feeling, when it disappears beneath the other refuse, a relief that is disproportionate and entirely appropriate. But first, 3 more weeks. Let me tell you about the schedule. The Victorian approach to infant feeding schedules is one of the great collective errors of the 19th century, executed with extraordinary confidence and extremely poor outcomes, and a rigidity that boggles the mind of anyone who knows what breastfeeding actually requires to work. The schedule is this: feed every 3 to 4 hours, not before, not after, on the clock. The infant who cries between feedings is to be comforted by other means: rocking, walking, the dummy dipped in honey or sugar water, but not offered the breast early, because feeding early undermines the schedule, and the schedule is what the books recommend, and the books are what the doctors recommend, and the doctors are who your husband consults when he is uncertain. The reason the schedule is wrong is this: The production of milk is governed by a mechanism called supply and demand, meaning the breast produces more when it is emptied more frequently and less when emptied less frequently, and a scheduled feeding every 3 to 4 hours is not the same as the demand feeding that a newborn left to its own devices will perform, which is frequent and irregular and driven entirely by the baby's hunger rather than by the clock on the mantelpiece. The breast, asked to produce on a schedule rather than on demand, produces less. The baby, fed on a schedule rather than on demand, is sometimes hungry and cannot communicate its hunger in any way other than crying, and the crying is managed by honey dummies and rocking while the breast sits quietly producing less than it was producing yesterday. You don't know this. Not precisely. Not in those terms. What you know is that between 3 and 4 in the afternoon, Eleanor cries as though she's been left alone in the wilderness, cries with a desperation that your body responds to physically, a tingling release in your breasts that you've learned is the milk responding to her voice. And you look at the clock, and the clock says 2:47, and the schedule says not yet. And you hold Eleanor and rock her and try the sugar water on her lips, and she rejects it with total contempt and cries, and you count the minutes to 3 o'clock with the concentration of a person who has been told the rule matters more than the reality directly in front of her. The monthly nurse enforces the schedule. She is a sensible woman. She is a kind woman. She has 20 years of experience, and she is enforcing the schedule because the schedule is what the books recommend, and the books are what the doctors wrote. She is not wrong by the standards of 1862. She is wrong by the standards of what is actually happening in front of both of you. But those standards don't exist yet, won't exist for decades, and cannot be accessed by any reasoning available to her. You let Eleanor feed at 2:53. You tell the nurse the clock was fast. The nurse looks at you with an expression that suggests she knows perfectly well the clock was not fast and has decided this is not the battle she's going to have today. Eleanor feeds. Eleanor stops crying. Your breast, which has been producing milk since Eleanor's 2:47 desperation activated the tingling release, is now being emptied by Eleanor's efficient sucking, which will, because the system is built this way, produce more milk, slightly more than yesterday, because Eleanor asked and was answered. The supply and the demand are gradually finding each other, slowly, through a fog of incorrect scheduling and lead shields and glass pumps, and the competing instruction of several books that disagree on methodology while agreeing on confidence. You're figuring it out. You and Eleanor together. You're figuring out, without instruction and without framework, the thing that the Victorian medical establishment was too confident and too removed to explain. Now, let me tell you something about the moral dimensions, because the Victorian breastfeeding experience is not only physical, it's not only the glass pump and the lead shield and the cord and the schedule and the fever in Bermondsey and Mary Baines's carefully composed face. It is also, perhaps primarily, in terms of how it's lived from the inside, a moral experience. A site of judgment and self-judgment, and the particular Victorian capacity for making the most biological of processes into a referendum on character. The good mother breastfeeds. This is not a gentle suggestion. This is doctrine. It comes from the medical establishment and from the religious establishment, and from Mrs. Beeton, and from the books your mother sent, and from the advice of every woman who has gone through this before you and survived it, and therefore feels qualified to prescribe it. The good mother breastfeeds because it is natural, and because it is healthier for the infant, and because it is the sacrifice that motherhood requires, and because, And this last one is the one that sits most heavily. Because the woman who cannot or will not breastfeed is failing at the most fundamental female task. The failure is not neutral. It is not simply, this particular biological process didn't work for this particular pair of bodies, which is the version that would be true and accurate and humane. It is, something is wrong with her. She is insufficient. She is too delicate, or too selfish, or too governed by vanity to accept the physical demands of nursing, or this one was in the air in certain circles in 1862. Her constitution is not suited to it, meaning her constitution is less robust than a good woman's constitution should be, meaning she is, in the specific taxonomy of Victorian womanhood, deficient. The women who hire wet nurses, wealthy women, women of class and means, who have always hired wet nurses, who come from a tradition of hiring wet nurses that stretches back through their mothers and grandmothers without pause. These women are partially insulated from the moral judgment, because the hiring of wet nurses is itself a class marker, a thing that wealthy women do, a thing that is assumed about them. Their breastfeeding failure, such as it is absorbed into the general category of the privileges of their station. The women who are not wealthy enough to hire wet nurses and not poor enough for it to go without question. The women in the middle, the doctors' wives in Kensington, the merchants' wives in Bloomsbury, the solicitors' wives in Islington. These women navigate something more complicated. They are expected to try. They are expected to succeed. They are expected to manage their bodies and their infants and their schedules and their pain with the same composed efficiency that they manage everything else in their households. And if they fail, if the crack doesn't heal, or the cord becomes an abscess, or the milk diminishes, or the baby refuses, then they fail not just in this specific instance, but as women, in the Victorian understanding of what women are for. You sit in your chair in the lying-in room on the 12th day, and Eleanor is feeding properly, feeding well, the crisis resolved into management, and the management resolving slowly towards something like ordinary nursing. And you are aware that you have come through the worst of it, and you're also aware that you have been judged every step of the way. By the books, by the advice, by the nurse's expression when you feed Eleanor 10 minutes before the scheduled time, by the question implicit in your husband's suggestion about the boat on day 2, by the impossibility of any conversation about how much this has hurt, without that conversation becoming, in its implications, a conversation about your fitness for this task. The glass pump sits on the dressing table. The lead shield sits next to it. The chamomile compress is in the basin, cold now, waiting to be heated. The books are on the shelf, their advice ranging from useful to actively harmful, and you cannot tell by looking at them which is which. Eleanor's hand grips the fabric of your nightgown. You look at her face. Everything else recedes. Not permanently, not completely. You'll be back in the chair in 3 hours, and the nurse will remind you about the schedule, and the cord will ache in the way healing tissue aches, and Mary Baines will come in at some point with her composed face and her eye on something you can't see, and all of it will continue. But right now, Eleanor, her hand gripping, her eyes closed, her face doing the thing it does when she's feeding, the subtle flickering of expression that might be contentment or might be concentration, or might just be the way infant faces move when blood sugar is rising and the body is doing exactly what it needs to do. That's enough. For this moment, that's enough. Let me tell you what the Victorian women knew that they didn't have language for. They knew, in the body, in the specific knowledge that lives below the level of articulation, that this was harder than anyone was admitting, that the natural and instinctive and God-given process was, for many of them, not natural and not instinctive, and was instead a skill that required learning and support and time and information, and all of which were in short supply. They knew this in the way women have always known things that aren't officially known, the way knowledge lives in communities rather than in books, passed from mother to daughter to neighbour to nurse in the spaces between the official instruction. They knew about the crack and how to treat it before the books put it in writing. They knew about the engorgement and the heat compress, and the importance of drainage before the medical establishment acknowledged it. They knew, some of them, about the schedule's limitations, even if they couldn't say so in the terms that would be legible as expertise. What they didn't have was authority. The knowledge lived in women, and the authority lived in men, and in 1862 that gap is not a small one. The monthly nurse knows things that Dr. Lawson doesn't know, and Dr. Lawson knows things that are wrong, and both of them are more listened to than Ellen Marsh in her room in Bermondsey, who knows things they've both forgotten. The hierarchy of whose knowledge counts is not a hierarchy of whose knowledge is accurate. It is, in 1862, almost never a hierarchy of whose knowledge is accurate. You've been lying in for 14 days now. The monthly nurse is preparing to leave at the end of the week. The lying-in room will become simply the bedroom again. The curtains will be opened, the windows, finally, blessedly, will be opened, and you will be officially about, which means recovered, which means resuming the household, which means the long, complicated return to being a woman who does all the things women of your station do, plus this additional thing, this constant, necessary, urgent thing, feeding Eleanor. You are not ready. You know you're not ready, not because you can't do it. You can. You've learned enough in these 2 weeks to know that you can, that the worst is probably behind you. But because the support is going away, the nurse who knows what a cord looks like and how to use the pump, and when to be concerned, and you will be doing this without her, in a house where the other adult is your husband, and your husband is a doctor, and knows a great deal about a great many things and almost nothing about this particular thing. You're going to ask him. You're going to have this conversation, the one you've been not having for 2 weeks, where you say, I need you to understand this, not cure it, not fix it, not suggest the boat. Understand it. I need you to know that the schedule is wrong, and the books are sometimes wrong, and Mary Baines is leaving, and I am going to be doing this largely on my own, and there will be bad days and good days, and the bad days are not moral failures, they are just bad days, and I need you to know the difference. You're going to have that conversation. Not today. Today you are too tired, and Eleanor is feeding, and the fire is low, and the day is coming to its end in the slow way that days in this room come to their ends. But soon. You will have it soon. For now, the quiet, the sounds of the house settling around you, the creak of the floors, the distant rumble of London going about its London business in the streets beyond the shut windows. Below you Charles is in his study. You know the sounds of his study, the occasional scrape of a chair, the clink of the decanter, the muffled sound of the street when the study window opens. He'll come up at 9 or 10, look in, check on you both, ask how you are in the way he asks when he means it, but can't quite find the right shape for the question. You'll tell him better, because it is better. It is. It is also still hard, and will be hard for weeks more, and will be hard in ways you couldn't have anticipated, and which no book and no nurse and no amount of reading has quite prepared you for, because the hardness is specific to you and to Eleanor and to the particular negotiation between your bodies which is unlike anyone else's negotiation, and which will resolve in its own time and not on the schedule. The fire settles. Eleanor's breathing slows. She is sinking the way newborns sink, from feeding into sleep with no intermediate state, going from urgency to total unconsciousness, with the completeness of a very small animal that has no interest in half measures. Her hand loosens on your nightgown. She lets go, and you hold her anyway. Let me take you outside this room for a little while. Let me take you into the broader landscape of this, into the world that surrounds the lying-in room, and the glass pump and Mary Baines's composed face and the penknife in Bermondsey. Let me take you to the street. London in 1862 does not accommodate nursing mothers with any particular grace. This is not an opinion. It is a documented architectural, cultural fact. The city is built for movement and commerce and the efficient conduct of business, and the nursing mother is not, in 1862, understood as a person who participates in movement and commerce. She is understood as a person who exists in a room, specifically in the lying-in room for the first month, and then gradually in the domestic sphere more broadly, the interior world of the household, the visiting that takes place within drawing rooms and the walking that takes place in parks, and the shopping that takes place in shops where there are no accommodations for anything she might need to do with her body. You will discover this on the first day you venture out. It's 3 weeks after the birth. Charles accompanies you. Eleanor is at home with the nursemaid who's replaced the monthly nurse, a girl named Bessie who is 16 and kind and slightly terrified of Eleanor, which Eleanor appears to find appropriate. The day is mild. The streets of Kensington are as they always are. The carriages, the servants on errands, the dogs, the smell of coal and horse, and the particular sweetness of the bakery on the corner that perfumes the entire block from early morning. You are wearing your corset, not laced as tightly as before the birth. You are being careful. The nurse's warning about pressure on the milk ducts has stayed with you, but you're wearing it, because without it your clothes don't fit, and without your clothes fitting you are not dressed. Which is to say, you are not a respectable woman in a respectable street. You are a person without proper form, and the invisibility of that is not something your station allows. You're out for 40 minutes. After 35 minutes, your body tells you with the precision of a machine that it's time. The tingling release, the pressure in the breast, the physical insistence of milk that has been building since the last feed and is no longer willing to wait. Eleanor is home and not available to receive it. Your body does not know this. Your body knows only now. You're on Kensington High Street. There is nowhere to go. There is no shop you can step into and ask, because the asking is impossible. You understand that the asking is impossible the moment you imagine doing it. Imagine finding a shopwoman or a shopman and explaining that you need. There is no facility, no room, no bench with privacy, nothing. There are people everywhere. There is the street. There is your corset pressing against the swelling pressure, and your dress pressing against your corset, and the absolute impossibility of doing anything about any of it while standing on Kensington High Street in 1862. You go home. In the carriage, pressed against Charles's shoulder with his coat over you as a screen, you do what you have to do. He understands. He does not watch. He talks about something to do with a patient, a respiratory complaint. The coal smoke again fills the silence with words that give you cover, and you manage what your body needs managed, and when you get home you go upstairs and find Eleanor awake and hungry. And the relief of that, of Eleanor's hunger meeting your supply at exactly the right moment is physical and total. Charles sees later that you should not go out so far until you're more established. He means it helpfully. He means the world outside is not configured for what you're doing, and until what you're doing becomes easier, you should stay in the configured space. He is not wrong, technically. He is not wrong. You don't tell him what it costs to hear it. You'll go out again in another week, shorter distances with more calculation, with Bessie accompanying you as a screen if needed, with the map of the streets you know between home and wherever you're going, the calculation of distances and timing, and when Eleanor last fed, and how long you have before your body makes the decision for you. You'll do this calculation every time you leave the house for months. It will become automatic. It will become part of what you are, part of the person who exists outside the room as well as inside it. The woman with the body doing this urgent necessary thing that the world outside your front door cannot quite accommodate. Other women do the same calculation. All of them. Every one of them who nurses all across the city. The women in Bermondsey and Bloomsbury and Bethnal Green. The calculation is different in different neighbourhoods, cruder in some, more fraught in others, more public in the ones where privacy is not something anyone has ever been able to afford, but the calculation is always there. The constant management of a body that does not know about schedules or streets or social propriety, that knows only now. This is 1862, and it will be this way for a very long time. Come back to the room. It's evening. The curtains are drawn and the fire is lit, and Eleanor is in the cradle, fed, sleeping, her face doing the flickering thing it does when she sleeps, the rapid, small expressions of infants that people sometimes call dreaming. Mary Baines left yesterday. Her last morning she came in, like every morning, and fed Eleanor her breakfast feed, and when Eleanor finished and fell away from the breast into sleep, Mary looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she didn't bother composing. She looked at her the way she looked at Thomas, you thought. Then she composed it again and handed Eleanor to you and said, "She's doing beautifully. She is," you said. "Thank you, Mary." And Mary picked up her bag and went downstairs and went back to the agency, who would find her another household, where there would be another baby who needed what her body had to give, and she would give it. And somewhere in Hackney Thomas would continue existing or not existing, and the calculation would run, and Mary would manage it the way she'd managed it twice before. You don't know what happened to Thomas. You never found out. It didn't occur to you to find out, which is its own kind of fact about 1862 and what it did and didn't consider worth finding out. But the shape of not knowing is still there. 4 years later, when you've moved on, and Eleanor is a person who walks and speaks, and has her father's ears and her grandmother's hair, and you still don't know, let me tell you what you learned, not what you were taught. What you learned in the lying-in room, in the chair by the fire, in the 40 minutes on Kensington High Street, in the watching of Mary Baines's face, and the listening to what didn't get said, and the counting of the minutes to 3 o'clock. You learned that the body is not a moral instrument, that its failures and its struggles are not indictments, that the woman in Bermondsey with the penknife and the abscess is not less virtuous than you are with your glass pump and your monthly nurse. She is living the same process with fewer resources, and the outcome differences between you are not differences in character. You learned that the books are sometimes right and sometimes wrong, and that you can't tell by looking at them which is which, and that the person who has actually done the thing you're trying to do is more useful, usually, than the person who has written about it from a distance. You learned that your body will tell you things before anyone else does, and that learning to listen to it, to the heat and the pressure and the tingling and the crack and the smell of the compress when the nurse unwraps it, is not hysteria, not emotion, not the weakness of sex, but information. Accurate, specific, urgent information, and the failure to act on it is what creates abscesses. You learned that Eleanor is her own person, entirely and from the first day, with her own specific requirements and her own specific schedule and her own specific rejection of anything that isn't what she actually needs. And the job is not to make her fit the instructions, but to find the fit between her and you, which takes time and failure and patience and is not ultimately findable in any book. The fire is burning low again. Eleanor sleeps. Outside, London is doing what London always does. The perpetual engine of it, the carriages and the voices and the coal smoke and the river, and the 500,000 separate lives going about their 500,000 separate urgencies. All of it pressing against the walls of this room where you've spent 3 weeks becoming someone new. Not entirely new. The same person, essentially, but extended somehow. Larger in some directions and smaller in others, with knowledge you didn't have before, and a body that has changed in ways both visible and not, and a daughter in the cradle who has your eyes and her father's ears, and who has, in 3 weeks, become the thing everything else is organised around. The candle on the nightstand burns, the shadows shift. You're tired in the specific cellular way that nursing mothers are tired, a tiredness that goes all the way down, that is not a state you can reason your way out of or caffeinate your way through, but simply a fact of what your body is doing, the continuous metabolic work of producer ilk, the interrupted sleep, the night feeds, the day feeds, the constant presence of Eleanor's need in your nervous system, even when she's not crying, a low hum of attentiveness that never quite turns off. You could sleep. You should sleep. Bessie is down the hall if Eleanor needs anything. The house is quiet. The street is quieting. You sit for a little longer in the chair. You think about the glass pump on the dressing table. You should return it to the nurse or to Dr. Lawson's nurse, wherever it came from. You haven't yet. It's been sitting there for a week, polished and cold and unused, a relic of the worst days. You'll deal with it tomorrow. You'll deal with the lead shield tomorrow too. There's a long list of things you'll deal with tomorrow. Tomorrow when Eleanor is fed, and the morning is established, and you have the particular narrow window of energy that exists between the morning feed and the midday one. Tomorrow you'll deal with it. Tonight, this, the fire, the sleeping child, the room that has been your whole world for 3 weeks, and which tomorrow you will begin to leave behind. London settles around you. The church bell, St. Mary Abbots, Kensington, 4 blocks away, its bell high and clear and slightly different in pitch from every other church bell in the area, strikes 9. 9 o'clock. Eleanor breathes. You breathe. Let me keep you here a little longer. In this room, in this hour, in the particular peace that comes after the crisis and before the next thing, because the next thing is always coming, and it's all right for the moment between them to last a little longer than it means to. The Victorian woman in the lying-in room knew something that took the medical establishment another century to formally acknowledge, that the first weeks of nursing are not a performance to be evaluated against a standard, but a negotiation to be survived, that the body and the infant and the supply and the demand are in constant conversation, and the conversation has its own timeline, and rushing it or scheduling it or applying glass instruments to it with insufficient attention to what the skin is telling you. All of this prolongs rather than shortens the difficulty. They knew this. They taught it to each other. It lived in the communities of women who passed through the lying-in rooms and came out the other side with their bodies and their children and their accumulated knowledge of what actually helps versus what the books say. That knowledge was never written down in a form that counted, but it was there. It's still there. The room is dark now, except for the fire's last orange pulse, the candle down to a stump, the shadows deep in the corners. Eleanor sleeps the sleep of the fed and the safe, and the entirely unaware of how much it cost to get here, how many women in how many rooms in how many versions of this same scene navigated the same glass instruments and the same moral weight and the same gap between what was promised and what was actually required. She doesn't need to know. She just needs to sleep. You put her down in the cradle, carefully, with the specific care of parents who have learned that the putting down is a moment of high consequence, that the transition from held to placed can undo in seconds what took 40 minutes to achieve, and Eleanor makes a small sound and then is still, and you stand there for a moment with your hand on the side of the cradle. Outside, London, always London. The horses on the cobblestones, someone laughing somewhere, the distant sound of the river, everything that the city is doing and has always been doing and will still be doing, long after this particular room and this particular woman and this particular small crisis of feeding a small child in a hard time have been absorbed into the vast undifferentiated past. The river is still there. St. Mary Abbots is still there. The streets outside are still there. And in rooms all across the city, in Bermondsey and Bloomsbury and Bethnal Green and Hackney and Stepney and Kensington, women are sitting in chairs by fires, listening to their children breathe, tired in the way that goes all the way down, and none of them are failures, and none of them are insufficient, and all of them are doing something that the century they're living in does not have adequate language to honour. They're doing it anyway. They always did it anyway. You look at Eleanor one more time. She is, as Mary said, doing beautifully. You go to the window, not to open it, not yet. The nurse's instructions about draughts still carrying some residual weight, but to look through it, through the gap in the heavy curtains, at the street below. Kensington at 9 in the evening, the lamps cast in their yellow pools on the wet cobblestones. It rained in the late afternoon while you slept. The occasional figure passing, the city in its evening mode. You've been in this room for 3 weeks. Tomorrow you'll begin the process of leaving it. Not all at once, not dramatically. The curtains will open, the windows will open. Bessie will bring Eleanor's things into the household properly. Charles will have his study back to himself in the evenings. The shape of ordinary life will reassemble around this new extraordinary element, this 7-pound person who requires so much and knows nothing about what she requires except that she requires it now. You'll navigate it. You've been navigating it. The glass pump and the lead shield and Mary Baines's face and the 40 minutes on Kensington High Street and the moral weight of every book on that shelf and Ellen Marsh in Bermondsey and the neighbour woman's penknife. All of it has been, underneath everything, a navigation, a finding of the way through something that had no clearly marked path, in a time that gave you no map and only confused instructions and asked you to succeed anyway. You have. You are. The curtain falls back against the window. You cross to the bed. You lie down. The sounds of London arrive through the glass, muffled, filtered, familiar now in a way they weren't 3 weeks ago, the specific register of this particular part of the city becoming the texture of your life, the sound your daughter is growing up hearing, the sound that will be when she is older and living somewhere else, the sound that means home. You're warm enough, you're fed enough, you're safe enough. Eleanor is 4 feet away, breathing the slow breath of infants who have not yet learned that breath is something you have to maintain, who breathe as though it's the simplest thing in the world, as though it has never occurred to anyone that it might not be. It will keep on being difficult. The next weeks, the next months will have their own difficulties, their own middle-of-the-night crises, their own small emergencies that you'll navigate and survive and add to the knowledge that lives in you rather than in the books. But you'll navigate them. You will. The tiredness comes up from below, the real tiredness, the one that means sleep is actually possible rather than just theoretical, and you let yourself sink into it. The way you've learned to let yourself sink into it when the window is there, when Eleanor is asleep and Bessie is down the hall, and nothing needs you right this second. Nothing needs you right this second. The fire is a faint warmth across the room. The city is a faint sound beyond the glass. Eleanor breathes. You breathe. And hundreds of years from now, someone will lie down at the end of their own difficult day, with their own form of tired and their own form of relief, and the things that have not changed. The need for rest, the weight of getting through the day, the particular quality of the moment when you've done what you needed to do and can finally stop. Those things will be there. They're always there. In every version of this room, in every era, in every city. Some things don't change. The human body doing what human bodies do, feeding and healing and failing and surviving, doesn't change. The need to lie down after all of it doesn't change. Morning comes the way mornings come now, not as a single arrival, but as a series of them, each one earlier than the last, each one announced by Eleanor rather than by the clock. The clock on the mantelpiece says 5:20. Eleanor says now, which in her vocabulary is expressed not with words but with the escalating architecture of infant distress. These small sounds that start almost conversational and progress, if not answered, into something that carries through walls. You are awake before the sounds begin. This is the thing nobody warned you about either. The way your sleep has reorganized itself around her. The way some part of your brain has stayed on watch even while the rest of you slept, attuned to the frequency of her breath. The micro changes in the sounds the cradle makes when she shifts, so that by the time she produces the first genuine sound of hunger, you're already surfacing, already moving, already crossing the cold floor to the cradle. 5:20 in the morning. The fire has been banked down to embers. The room is cold in the way rooms are cold at this hour. A different cold from the afternoon cold or the evening cold, this one grey and close and damp at the edges. Your nightgown is thin against it. Your feet on the floorboards register the cold in the specific pained way of bare feet, on Victorian floors at 5:20 in August. Because August in London is not, whatever the calendar claims, reliably warm, and the stones below the boards hold the cool of the night long into the morning. You lift Eleanor. She is wet. The napkin has soaked through to the flannel wrapper, and there is warmth where there should be dryness and a smell, sharp and animal and completely familiar now, the smell of her. And she makes her sound again, impatient, because hunger precedes everything else in Eleanor's hierarchy of needs, and the indignity of the wet napkin is simply an additional grievance layered on top of the primary emergency. You change her in the dim. This is something else you've learned. How to do things in the near dark. How to navigate by touch and muscle memory. the small operations required to care for a person who cannot yet care for herself, the pins of the napkin, the flannel wrapper, the clean linens folded on the table by the cradle. You could do this with your eyes shut now, and sometimes you effectively do, because your eyes at 5:20 in the morning are operating at approximately 2/3 capacity, and your hands are operating at full. Eleanor receives the clean napkin with the patience of someone who knows that dry is coming, but hasn't quite forgiven you for wet. Then you sit in the chair. Then she feeds. This morning, unlike the mornings of the first 2 weeks, unlike the mornings with the pump and the shield and the composing of herself while the nurse applies the compress, this morning she latches in under 15 seconds, the two of you finding each other in the dark with the ease of something practiced. Because it is practiced. Because you have done this, at this hour or close to it, every day for 3 weeks, and the body learns. Your body learns. Her body learns. The Victorian medical establishment would call this establishment of habit. What it actually is, what it feels like from inside, is something more fundamental than habit. It is two organisms finding the frequency they were always supposed to share, and finally, imperfectly, beautifully, sharing it. The fire gives it small warmth. The city outside is just beginning its early sounds, the ones before the main noise begins, the carter making the first run of the morning, the distant bells of the early churches, a dog, a horse, the specific register of London not quite yet awake. And you sit in the chair in the grey morning light and feed your daughter, and the glass pump is on the dressing table, and you haven't used it in 4 days, and the crack on your right nipple is a faint line that aches only when pressed, and the cord is entirely gone, and this morning you are genuinely, unreservedly better. That's something. That's quite a lot, actually. Now let me take you somewhere else. Let me take you to a place that exists alongside your lying-in room, runs parallel to it, serves the same biological function from an entirely different social position. Let me take you to the lying-in hospital. There are several of them in London in 1862. The Queen Charlotte's, which opened in 1752 and is the oldest in Marylebone. The Royal Maternity Charity, which sends midwives to women who can't come to it. The lying-in wards attached to the general hospitals, St Bartholomew's, Guy's, the Middlesex, where the poorer cases go when there is nowhere else. Go to Queen Charlotte's, walk through the door that the women of the neighbourhood walk through, when they have no monthly nurse and no lying-in room, and no Charles who paces downstairs and no books on the shelf, when they have a landlord and a husband and children already, and a baby coming who cannot wait for convenient circumstances. Walk through that door and into a ward, not a room, a ward, a long room with iron beds ranked along both walls and a stove at one end, and the smell that you would recognise if you've been in your lying-in room for 3 weeks. The same smell, the same layers, except here multiplied by 12 beds, 12 women. Some of them just delivered, some of them 3 days out, 4, 5, some of them about to be. The ward nurse moves between the beds with the efficiency of a woman managing a small factory. She has no glass pump. She has experience and a piece of linen and a knowledge of the blocked duct that comes from having treated approximately 500 of them in this ward alone. She has hands that know what they're doing. She has very little time. The women in the beds are not in the main married in any sense that 1862 recognises as official. Some of them are. Some of them are women whose husbands are working men who cannot afford the £2 a month nurse, or the extra coal or the extra food, and so have arranged this, the hospital, as the alternative. But many of them are what 1862 calls fallen women, which is a category so broad it encompasses everything from the seduced and abandoned domestic servant to the woman who had the wrong kind of love for the wrong kind of man. And what they share is that they are here, in this ward, delivering their children in the company of strangers under the supervision of the church charity that funds this institution. They will be allowed to keep their children. This is not guaranteed everywhere. Some of the institutions that serve this population require, as condition of admission, surrender of the infant. The Foundling Hospital, which is not a lying-in hospital, but which receives what lying-in hospitals produce, takes children from women who cannot keep them, and the women who leave their children there, who go through the lottery that determines whose child is accepted because more children are surrendered than the Foundling Hospital can hold. Those women go home empty-armed and are expected by society to be grateful. Here they can keep their children. They will leave in a week, back to whatever they came from, the lodgings or the position. Some of them have already arranged new positions, domestic service that will accept a nursing mother, which is rarer than it should be. Or back to the street, which is not a metaphor in 1862, which is an actual outcome for actual women with actual infants in their arms. The ward nurse comes to the bed at the end. This woman's name is Frances. She is 19. She was a milliner's assistant until 6 months ago, when the pregnancy became impossible to conceal and the milliner let her go. The man who is responsible for the pregnancy is a clerk in an insurance office in the city and knows about none of this, and will continue to know about none of this because Frances has made a decision, clear-eyed and without apparent bitterness, that telling him would cost more than it would recover. Frances's baby is a girl, no name yet. Frances is waiting to name her until she's sure she'll survive the first days, which is a reasonable caution in 1862, where infant mortality in the first week of life is high enough to recommend not getting too attached to names before the question of survival has been settled. The baby is nursing. Frances is doing what you did, in your chair in your room, navigating the new process with the same combination of instinct and ignorance and sheer bodily determination that seems to be, in the absence of any adequate instruction, what most women bring to this task. The ward nurse shows her the hold, adjusts the angle, makes a sound that means that, like that. Frances nods. What Frances does not have: the glass pump, the lead shield, the chamomile compress, the monthly nurse with her 20 years and her brisk competence, the warm room with the fire kept up, the books on the shelf, even though the books are mostly wrong, the husband pacing downstairs, the 3-hourly check by the woman who knows what a cord looks like before it becomes an abscess. What Frances has: the ward nurse when she can spare 10 minutes, the advice of the 11 other women in the ward who are at various stages of the same process, and whatever she can learn in the week before she leaves. In the bed next to Frances, a woman named Agnes is 3 days further along and has learned things Frances hasn't learned yet, and she is sharing them. Not because anyone has asked her to, but because this is what women do in wards, in courts, in back kitchens, in the spaces where the official instruction has not reached. They tell each other. They pass the knowledge that is not in the books between themselves, the knowledge of bodies and timing and what the heat compress actually needs to feel like, and how long to persevere before deciding something is wrong. This is what the Victorian medical establishment does not have a name for. This is how it actually worked. The ward nurse is back. She has 6 more beds to check. She doesn't have time for the conversation she knows is happening between Frances and Agnes, the transfer of knowledge that she could, if she had time, add her own experience to. She keeps moving. She does what she can. She has always done what she can. Let me tell you about the moral milk theory, because I've mentioned it and I haven't given it the full examination it deserves, and it deserves it because it is one of the more elaborately constructed pieces of wrongness in the Victorian medical canon, and its consequences were real, and they fell, as the consequences of elaborate wrongness always seem to, on the people who were least positioned to absorb them. The theory goes like this. A woman's milk is an expression of her constitution. Her physical constitution, obviously, the quality of her nutrition, the health of her body, the robustness of her system. But also, and here is where it becomes philosophical rather than physiological, her moral constitution, her character, her nature. Good women make good milk. The goodness of the milk is related to, not merely correlated with, not merely influenced by, but actually produced by, the goodness of the woman. Her piety, her equanimity, her social virtue, her freedom from strong passions. Strong passions corrupt the milk, specifically fear, anger, lust, grief, ambition, excitement, and, this one being particularly dangerous in the context of the wet nurse industry, class aspiration or social impropriety. A woman who desires things above her station makes inferior milk. A woman who has strayed from the moral order, the fallen woman, the illegitimate mother, makes milk that carries, in some sense beyond the chemical, the mark of her falling. This is the theory. It was held by doctors with medical degrees and published in journals with scientific pretensions, and repeated in books that sat on the shelves of women like you, and was taught to monthly nurses and used to evaluate the fitness of wet nurses, and was, from the point of view of anyone who has ever thought carefully about how milk is actually produced, entirely and completely without foundation. But here is what it does, this theory. It takes the difficulty of nursing, the cracks and the cords and the supply and the schedule and the fever in Bermondsey and the glass pump and all of it, and it makes the difficulty into evidence. Evidence of something wrong with the woman rather than something wrong with the circumstances, the information, the support, the instruments, the social arrangements. The woman whose milk doesn't come in well is constitutionally deficient. The woman whose baby doesn't thrive is morally suspect. The woman who uses a wet nurse is, at some level, abdicated. And the wet nurse herself is a paradox, necessary and contaminating simultaneously, her milk needed and her character permanently suspect, because a good woman would have a husband to support her and wouldn't need to sell her milk. You sat in that chair for 3 weeks, navigating a system that had built an entire moral architecture around the difficulty you were experiencing, that had made your struggling into evidence of your inadequacy, and the architecture was invisible to you while you were inside it, because that's what moral architectures do. They make themselves invisible to the people they're governing. The crack on your nipple was not your fault. The cord was not your fault. The schedule that was wrong was not your fault. Eleanor's difficulty latching was not yours or hers. It was 2 organisms learning a new coordination under suboptimal conditions, with inadequate support and too much incorrect instruction. None of it was fault. But fault is what the century made it. The women in the ward at Queen Charlotte's know this, in the way that women who don't have the luxury of pretending know things. Frances knows it. Agnes knows it. The ward nurse, who's been here long enough to see the architecture from the outside, knows it better than anyone and has no language the institution would recognise for saying so. They navigate it. That's what there is to do when the architecture is invisible to the people who maintain it, and the people who enforce it, and the people who write the books and run the hospitals and walk the wards. Navigate. Find the woman in the next bed. Listen. Tell her what you know. Keep going. Come back to your room. The morning has fully arrived now. The grey has given way to the particular London morning light, diffuse and yellowish, filtered through the coal smoke that sits above the city from approximately September through May, and at lower concentrations through the rest of the year. Charles is stirring below. You can hear the familiar morning sounds of his morning, the movements that map to particular times and particular sequences, the sound that means he's at the washstand, the sound that means he's dressing, the sound from the kitchen that means Bessie has the fire going and the tea is coming. Eleanor is fed and drowsy in your arms, doing the post-feed thing she does. The slow sink from full alertness into the halfway state that might become sleep or might resolve back into wakefulness, depending on factors you haven't yet identified with any consistency. You hold her. You look at her face. You think about Frances in the ward at Queen Charlotte's, 3 miles east of you, with her unnamed baby and her week before discharge and the 11 women in the beds around her who know things she needs to know. You think about Mary Baines in her next position, in some other lying-in room, doing this same thing for another woman's child while Thomas is in Hackney with her aunt. You think about Ellen Marsh in Bermondsey, thinner than before but healed, nursing Arthur from the good side while the right side remembers what the penknife did and slowly rebuilds itself. All of them doing the same thing. All of them in different rooms, different conditions, different versions of the same story with different amounts of support and different amounts of pain and different chances of the outcome being the one you want. All of them navigating. Eleanor's eyes flutter. Sleep or not sleep, you can't tell yet. You hold her either way. Outside, London grinds into its morning. The carters and the crossing sweepers and the shop boys and the coal merchants and the newspaper sellers and the thousands and thousands of people doing their thousands and thousands of things that make the city what it is. The engine of it. The perpetual commerce. The smell of coal and horse and the bakery on the corner putting its sweetness into the morning air. You will go outside today, not far. Not the full walk to the high street, not yet. But the garden, maybe, if the morning holds. The garden of the house, the little rectangle of London garden with its city sooty grass, and its one rose that Charles planted when you moved in, and which produces roses with more enthusiasm than its location would seem to justify. You and Eleanor and the late August morning. That's today's ambition. That's enough. Let me tell you about the weaning debate, because the breastfeeding experience in 1862 does not end when the feeding gets easier. It ends eventually at weaning, and the weaning debate is its own elaborate Victorian production, complete with competing schools of thought and confident wrongness and the application of moral weight to what is fundamentally a biological transition. The books, the good blue books on the shelf, Mrs. Beeton and the medical advisers, say, wean at 9 months. Some say 6, some say 12. They say it with the certainty of people who have computed an answer to a question that doesn't have a computable answer, who have looked at a highly individual variable baby-specific process and decided to assign it a date. 9 months. After 9 months, the milk is insufficient. After 9 months, the infant requires more substantial nourishment. After 9 months, the breast has served its purpose, and the continuance of nursing beyond this period is, here is where the moral architecture reasserts itself, not strictly necessary, and the woman who continues past the proper period is indulging either the infant or herself, both of which are problematic. The infant who is nursed too long becomes, and this is stated in print in books that sit in the homes of respectable families, becomes dependent, weak, insufficiently robust for the challenges of Victorian life. A boy who is nursed past 9 months is in danger of feminization, of softness, of a failure to develop the character that manhood requires. The mother who nurses too long is attached in a manner that is not becoming, is prioritizing her own emotional requirements, the comfort of nursing, the intimacy of it, over the developmental needs of her child, is, in the specific taxonomy of Victorian maternal failure, too much, too present, too physical, too much a body and not enough a guiding spirit. The ideal mother in 1862 loves from a slight distance, is present but not overwhelming, is warm but contained, is physical in the approved way, the embrace, the arranged shawl, the goodnight kiss, and not physical in the ways that have bodily urgency and bodily mess and bodily need attached to them. The nursing mother is too much body. She is tolerated for the period of necessity and expected to resolve herself back into propriety as soon as the necessity ends. 9 months. You will nurse Eleanor for 14 months. You will not tell anyone except Charles. Who knows, because he lives in the same house. And who has decided, bless him, in this particular matter, bless him, that Eleanor's visible health and Eleanor's increasing robustness and Eleanor's weight gain at the 4-month check, the 6-month check, the 9-month check, are more compelling evidence than the book's opinion about what sufficient milk is. He is a doctor who knows other doctors who are wrong. He is not incapable of noticing it. In this particular matter, he has noticed it. You will nurse Eleanor for 14 months, and she will wean herself, gradually, the feeds reducing one by one over the course of 2 months, until there is only the morning feed, and then there is not even that. And one morning she will simply not ask, and you will wait, and she will not ask, and by the evening it will be clear that she has decided, in her own Eleanor way, that she is finished. And you will feel, this is the part you're not expecting, you will feel something that is not entirely relief, something more complicated. The thing you've been doing, that you fought to do, that cost you the glass pump and the lead shield and the cracked skin and the 3 weeks in the room and Mary Baines's composed face. The thing is ending, and it's Eleanor who's ending it, and she doesn't know that she's ending it. She's just a 14-month-old person who decided this morning that she had other interests, and you will sit in the chair, the same chair, 3 seasons later, the fire different, the light different, Eleanor different, you different, and you will feel the particular bitter sweetness of something that was hard and necessary and eventually imperfectly yours coming to its end. But that's 14 months from now. Right now it's the morning of day 18, and Eleanor is in your arms and Bessie is at the door with the tea. Let me take you to the shop. Not literally, you're not going to any shops today. But let me take you to what's in the shops, what you can buy in 1862 to address the specific problems of the nursing mother, because the Victorian marketplace has an answer to every problem, or what it presents as an answer, and the nursing problems are no exception. The chemists on Kensington High Street, the one you pass on your way to anywhere, sells, among its many preparations, the following items specifically relevant to your current situation. Laudanum, first. Tincture of opium in alcohol, available without prescription, recommended for a range of infant ailments, including the one called teething, and the one called colic, and the one that is really just crying at night, but which, given that it prevents the parents from sleeping, has been elevated in the medical literature to the status of a genuine complaint requiring pharmaceutical intervention. Laudanum quiets infants. It quiets them the way opiates quiet everything, by suppressing the nervous system until the nervous system decides not to express urgency. Mothers give it. Monthly nurses give it. Baby farmers give it in industrial quantities. Eleanor will not receive laudanum. This is a decision you've made without quite making it, the way you make decisions in this period about things you can't fully articulate. In your body first, a knowing before the knowing, and then later in words. You don't know that laudanum kills infants. Not exactly. Not in the specific dosage and consequence language that would make it legible as knowledge rather than instinct. You know that it quiets too completely sometimes. You've heard things, enough things. Eleanor will not receive laudanum. She'll cry at night. She will do this for several months, and Bessie will lose sleep over it, and Charles will lose sleep over it, and you will lose sleep over it with such regularity that sleep deprivation will become simply the texture of your life, the background condition, like the coal smoke and the city noise. But she will be alive in the morning, every morning, alive. That's not nothing. The chemist also sells, in the back of the shop where you have to ask for it specifically, and the asking requires a particular composure because the asking is not entirely comfortable, the nipple glass. This is not the pump. The pump you have, courtesy of the monthly nurse, but the nipple glass specifically, a small device like a suction cup designed to be worn between feeds to draw out the flat or inverted nipple, to extend and shape the tissue so that the infant can latch more easily. The instructions say to apply it for 20 minutes before each feed. The experience of applying it is something most women describe in terms that range from merely uncomfortable to genuinely alarming. You don't need it. Eleanor has managed without it, but it sits on the shelf of the chemist, and dozens of women in Kensington buy it every month and go home and sit with it and add it to the collection of glass instruments that Victorian medicine has decided is the appropriate way to interact with the nursing breast. Glass. Always glass. Cold and smooth and unforgiving, and completely unlike the warm living tissue it's meant to help. There is also, at the better chemists, the ones that cater to the medical profession directly, the ones that supply hospitals and private physicians, there is also the breast reliever. This is a more elaborate version of the pump, with a more elaborate glass vessel and a more elaborate suction mechanism, and a price that puts it beyond the reach of most women in most circumstances, but which, for the woman whose milk is slow to come in, or whose supply is flagging, is prescribed by doctors with the confidence that the more expensive the instrument, the more effective the intervention. There is very little evidence that more elaborate glass is more effective than less elaborate glass. There is, in 1862, very little evidence about anything to do with this subject, because the subject has not been studied by anyone with the methodological tools to study it properly, and will not be for quite some time. In the absence of evidence, confidence substitutes. In the absence of knowledge, instruments fill the space. The glass pump, the nipple shield, the nipple glass, the breast reliever. The entire range of glass objects that Victorian medicine interposes between the nursing body and the nursing infant, each one promising to correct a problem that is in many cases created or exacerbated by the previous intervention. The pump replaces the feeding that would correct the supply naturally. The schedule creates the supply problem that the pump is meant to solve. The nipple shield prevents the contact that would strengthen the latch. The nipple glass draws out tissue that, Given adequate time and less glass might draw out on its own. Round and round. The chemist profits. The monthly nurse profits. The doctor profits. The woman in the chair at 5:20 in the morning profits in the sense of her daughter is alive, which is, when you strip everything else away, the point. The instruments and the interventions and the wrong advice and the correct advice and the lead and the glass and the moral architecture, all of it is organised in theory around this. The infant survives. Mostly they do. Some of them don't. The ones who don't are absorbed into the statistics that respectable London keeps carefully and discusses minimally and arranges its institutions around. The founding hospital and the lying-in wards and the baby farmers and the wet nurse agencies, the whole elaborate machinery of managing what happens when the nursing doesn't work, when the milk isn't there or the woman isn't there or the resources aren't there. The infant mortality statistics in 1862 are not something you look at directly. They exist in the medical journals and the public health reports and the deliberations of the General Register Office, and they are very bad, and the badness is distributed very unequally, with the infants of the poor dying at rates that the infants of the comfortable are largely protected from by the coal fires, and the monthly nurses and the glass pumps, and paradoxically, by the wet nurses who leave their own children at risk to reduce that risk. The distribution of survival is not random. It never is. Let me take you to the end of the month. You're in the garden. The rose Charles planted is in its late summer state, a little past its peak but still producing, the petals slightly loose on 2 or 3 of the flowers, the scent reaching you on the not quite warm enough August afternoon. Eleanor is in your arms, and she's looking at the garden with the specific expression she has developed for looking at things she hasn't looked at before, intense and slightly suspicious, as though the garden might have ulterior motives. Bessie is inside doing something that involves a broom and considerable energy. Charles is at his practice. The lying-in room upstairs is, as of this morning, the bedroom again. The curtains open, the windows, finally blessedly, open, the air moving through the room for the first time in 3 weeks in a way that makes it smell like a room rather than a medical intervention. You stand in the garden and hold Eleanor and look at the rose. She looks at it too. You cannot tell what she makes of it. She is 18 days old, and the rose is red, and the afternoon is grey, and the garden is small, and London presses in from every direction. The smell of it, the sound of it, the specific weight of this particular city at this particular moment, carrying itself over the garden wall and settling on the afternoon with the comfortable inevitability of something that has always been here and will always be here. Eleanor puts her hand out, not toward the rose specifically, just out, into the air. The way babies reach, not for anything in particular, but in the general direction of the world. You put your finger in her palm, she grips it. The grip of infants is extraordinary, disproportionate, a reflex technically, the Palmer grasp reflex, your husband explained it once. Neurological, not voluntary. It'll fade in a few months when the voluntary grasp develops. But in practice, in the experience of it, it feels like intention. It feels like holding on. Like Eleanor has assessed the available options and decided for this moment to hold on to you specifically. You let her hold on. The garden is small, the city is large, the afternoon is grey and the rose is red, and your daughter's hand has your finger, and this is, right now, in this specific combination of elements, everything. 3 weeks ago you were in the chair at 2 in the morning with the cracked nipple and the cord and the wrong schedule and the glass pump, and Mary Baines arriving to help with what your body couldn't yet manage on its own. 3 weeks ago you were in the thick of it, in the part where the books are wrong and the instruments hurt and the moral weight is everywhere, and the way through is not visible. 3 weeks and you are here, in the garden, in the August afternoon, in the grip of Eleanor's hand. This is what survives. The glass pump and the lead shield and the chamomile compress and the monthly nurse's instructions and the schedule that was wrong. All of that will become memory, and the memory will fade at the edges the way memories do. And what will remain, the thing that persists past the fading, is this: the garden, the afternoon, the rose, the hand. Eleanor is looking at something over your shoulder. A bird, maybe. A pigeon, which in London is what most airborne movement turns out to be. She's found this thing, this specific shape of motion against grey sky. Intensely interesting. Her face rearranging itself into concentrated attention, the suspicion giving way to something that might, in another few months, resolve into something you'd call delight. Not yet, but coming. She is 18 days old, and she has already, in these 18 days, changed in ways that are visible if you're watching closely and invisible if you blink. Her face is rounder. Her skin is less the alarming translucent red of the first days and more pink, human pink. Her hands are still excessively small but have begun to do things, reach, grip, wave in the general direction of the world. She sleeps differently than she slept at 3 days. More purposefully, if sleep can be purposeful, as though she has figured out the mechanics of it. She is learning. She is already learning. You stand in the garden and hold her and let her hold you back, and London goes about its business over the wall, and the rose drops one petal onto the slightly sooty grass, and somewhere in Hackney, Mary Baines's son Thomas is in a room with her aunt, and somewhere in Bermondsey, Ellen Marsh is doing what Ellen Marsh is doing, and in the ward at Queen Charlotte's, Francis has 8 more days before discharge, and all of it, all of these lives and these rooms and these bodies doing this necessary difficult thing, all of it is happening simultaneously in this city, in this afternoon, in this particular August that is already fading towards September. The pigeon lands somewhere in the garden next door. Eleanor watches it go. Then she looks back at you, and for a moment, one of those moments that doesn't quite fit into any category you have for moments, that isn't quite emotion, and isn't quite thought, and is somehow more real than either. For a moment she just looks at you. You look back, that's all. That's the whole thing. Come inside now. The afternoon is cooling. The coal smoke is thickening in the early evening way it thickens, settling down from the chimneys into the streets as the temperature drops, the city pulling its grey blanket up. Bessie has the fire going in the drawing room and the kettle on, and the sounds of the house in its early evening mode are the sounds you've been living with for years, and which now include a new sound, Eleanor's sound, the small percussive breathing of an infant in her cradle, which fills the rooms even when she's asleep, which you find yourself listening for when you can't hear it. You find yourself listening for it even in dreams. Charles comes home at 6:30. He comes into the drawing room and sees you in the chair by the fire, and Eleanor in the cradle, and the particular quality of the late afternoon settles over all of it, the way the right light settles over the right scene, and he stops in the doorway for a moment just looking. "Better today?" he asks. "Better, you say?" He comes in, sits across from you, accepts the cup of tea that Bessie brings. He's tired in the way he is tired on days when the practice has been full, the particular tiredness of attention given to many different people over many hours. But underneath that he is also, you can see it in the way he looked at Eleanor from the doorway. he is also something else, something that doesn't have a precise name. He is, you think, becoming a father, not in the legal or the social sense. He became that on the day Eleanor was born. The records were filed, the obligations are in place, but in the sense of a person for whom Eleanor is real and present, and the first thing you look at when you come into a room. That started happening around day 5 or 6. You noticed it happen, a shift in his eyes when he looked at the cradle, a quality of attention that wasn't there on day 1. Day 1 he was afraid. You were both afraid on day 1. But the fear has given way to something more complex and more durable, and it looks, from where you're sitting in the chair by the fire, like what you've always understood love to look like when it's directed at something very small and very new. Careful, slightly stunned, completely out of proportion to the specific weight and capabilities of the object, and entirely irreversibly present. He reaches into the cradle. He offers Eleanor his finger. She grips it. The same grip, the same disproportionate reflex, the same ancient signal that means you are what I have and I am holding on. Charles looks at her face. She's changed, he says, even since this morning. They do that, you say, quickly. He nods. He believes it now in a way he didn't believe it when the monthly nurse said it on day 3, when it sounded like a pleasantry. He has watched Eleanor change for 18 days and he believes it. The fire burns. Eleanor holds his finger. The tea cools in the cups. And outside, London, always London, carrying on in all its directions, the enormous machinery of it, the commerce and the poverty and the river and the smoke and the 500,000 lives, all of it going on in the grey September afternoon without particular reference to what is happening in this drawing room, which is nothing much, which is everything. Let me tell you about what happens in November. November? Because November is when the cold arrives in earnest, when the coal fires are burning all day and the fog comes down and sits in the streets, in the specific yellow-grey London way that will be famous for centuries, and the particular challenge of November 1862 in the life of a nursing mother is this. Eleanor, at 14 weeks, has discovered she prefers to feed at intervals that are not the intervals the books recommend, and one of those intervals falls at approximately 4 in the morning, and the 4 in the morning feed requires you to get up in a cold that is different in quality from the August cold, more determined, more committed, settling into the house through the walls and the windows in a way that the fires can only partially address. 4 in the morning in November. The fire in the bedroom has been banked and is doing what banked fires do, keeping the room from absolute cold without providing the warmth of the afternoon. Your breath shows, just barely, in the air near the window. The floorboards are not just cold, they are the specific cold of stone under wood in a house that is not, by the standards of 20 years earlier, poorly built, but which has not been insulated in any meaningful sense because the concept of insulating a house against heat loss is not one that has been applied in this part of Kensington. You cross the floor. Your feet have opinions about this. Eleanor is making her sound, the 4 in the morning sound, which is quieter and more purposeful than the daytime hunger sounds, as though she too has made her peace with the fact that this hour is what it is, and there's no point adding drama to it. She is hungry, and you are here, and that is the arrangement. You pick her up and sit in the chair, which is cold, and wrap the shawl around both of you, which helps, and begin the feed. This is different from August, different from the white-knuckle sessions with the pump and the shield, different from the careful management of the cord. This is practice. This is the thing when it has become not easy, not without sensation, but familiar. Your body knows this. Her body knows this. The shape of the hold and the timing of the draw, and the sounds she makes when she's settled and when she's flagging and when she's finished. You know all of this now in the way you know the rooms of the house, in the way you know Charles's moods by the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, in the body rather than the mind. The city outside is quieter at 4 in the morning in November than it was at 4 in the morning in August. The cold keeps people in who the summer lets out. The sounds are fewer. Further away, the occasional cart, the occasional dog, the watchman calling the hour somewhere 3 streets over. London sleeping, almost sleeping. It never quite sleeps. But at 4 in the morning in November, it's as close as it gets. Eleanor feeds. The shawl holds the warmth between you. The fire is a low red glow. You're not thinking about the glass pump. You have not thought about the glass pump in 6 weeks. The pump is in a cupboard somewhere. You think Bessie put it away, somewhere in the back of the linen press. You're not entirely sure where. And it is not relevant. It was a tool for a crisis, and the crisis is long past. And what you have now is this. The 4 in the morning feed in the cold November room, the shawl, the fire's last warmth, Eleanor finding what she needs with the ease of 14 weeks of practice. It took this long, 14 weeks to get here. 14 weeks of glass pumps and lead shields and wrong schedules, and a monthly nurse and a wet nurse and a Dr. Lawson, and the cord that resolved and the crack that healed and the moral architecture pressing down on all of it, making every difficulty into evidence of character. 14 weeks to get to this quiet, this warmth in the cold room, this child finding what she needs. You put your cheek against the top of her head. Her hair, your mother's hair, the slight curl beginning, smells of warm and milk and something underneath that which is Eleanor specifically, Eleanor herself, the specific smell of this specific person who has been in the world for 14 weeks and has already become entirely irreplaceable. She makes a small sound, not hunger, not distress, something else, something that might be, in 14 weeks' time, the beginning of what will become, in another few months, a laugh. You stay very still because you don't want to disturb whatever this is. She does it again. And then settles back into feeding. Outside London is 4 in the morning in November, yellow and cold and going about its business in the small hours, the businesses that conduct themselves in the dark, the bakers and the night soil men and the night watchmen and whoever else the 4 in the morning city requires. In a room in Hackney, Mary Baines's son Thomas is 7 weeks old now, and alive, and his aunt is managing, and Mary is in her new position in Paddington, with a baby boy called George, who is 3 weeks old, and whose mother has cracked nipples and an engorgement that the agency's doctor has noted but pronounced non-critical. Mary is managing that too. She knows what she's doing. She has always known what she's doing. In Bermondsey, Ellen Marsh's Arthur is 14 weeks old, the same as Eleanor, and he's fat in the way that Bermondsey babies who survive their first weeks become fat. The specific fatness of infants whose bodies have decided in favour of life and are committing to it with vigour. Ellen is back at the market 3 mornings a week, selling the second-hand clothes Samuel collects on his rounds, Arthur strapped against her chest in a length of wool, nursing as they go. No glass pump for Ellen, no monthly nurse, no lying-in room with the curtains closed. Arthur nursing against her in the market, in the cold, in the noise and the smell of the November street, and nobody thinking anything of it except perhaps the women who come over to look at Arthur's face and tell Ellen he's a lovely boy, which he is, which Ellen knows, which she accepts with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has earned the right to this specific pride. The two babies, 14 weeks old, on opposite sides of the river, not the same story, but the same age, both alive, both held. Let me bring you back to the room. Eleanor has finished. She's in the post-feed state she arrives at around the 2-minute mark after finishing. Eyes open but not focused, mouth doing a slight motion that has nothing to do with feeding and everything to do with the sensory memory of feeding. Something between awake and asleep. You hold her. The fire's warmth is fading, but the shawl holds what you've made between you. The warmth of two bodies close together in a cold room. The oldest warmth there is. The warmth that predates coal fires and warm rooms and glass instruments and monthly nurses by a very long time, by the entire length of human history. Every mother and child in every cold room or cave or shelter doing this same thing, making warmth out of proximity. It is 4:15 in the morning. The church bell will ring the half hour in 15 minutes. You should put Eleanor down and sleep for the 2 hours before she wants the next feed, and Bessie needs to be up, and the day begins its beginning. You should. You don't. Quite yet. You hold her a little longer. Outside, London is what London always is. Enormous, indifferent in the abstract and completely entangling in the specific. The city that contains everything. Every version of this story and every version of every story. The richest rooms and the poorest courts and the river running through all of it, carrying everything to the sea. The 4:30 bell will ring. The morning will come. Eleanor will need feeding again and again after that, and the days will continue the way days do, accumulating into the weeks and the months and the particular life that you're living, which is not the life you imagined before it started, and is not like anything you could have been taught to expect. It is yours, hers, both of yours together, this negotiation, this finding of the way. The fire settles. The room is cold and warm at once, cold outside the shawl and warm inside it. Eleanor breathes, you breathe, the city breathes, and the sentry carries on around all of you, enormous and certain and completely wrong about some things and right about others, and the things it's wrong about will eventually be corrected, slowly, by the accumulation of evidence and the persistence of the women who kept telling each other what they knew in the spaces between the official instruction. The knowledge will outlast the wrongness. It always does. The 4:30 bell rings. Eleanor stirs, then settles. You put her in the cradle. Carefully, with the care of 4 in the morning and 14 weeks of practice, with the specific slow lowering that you have gotten very good at, that can bridge the gap between held and placed without rupturing the thin membrane of almost sleep. She stays down. You cross the cold floor. You get into bed. Outside, London. Always London. The river. Dark at this hour. Silver in the morning, carrying its cargo of everything to the sea. The churches, their bells marking the hours you sleep and the hours you don't sleep. The streets, the people in them, the lives in all their versions, the Francises and the Ellens and the Marys and the women in the ward at Queen Charlotte's, and the women in the rooms above the tanneries and the women in the rooms in Kensington, with their glass pumps and their lead shields and their wrong schedules and their bodies doing this ancient necessary thing, finding the way through in the dark. All of them, all at once, this city, this November, this century that doesn't yet know what it doesn't know. You are tired in the way that goes all the way down. the bone tired of a person who has been doing something physically demanding for 14 weeks without adequate rest. And you have learned to sleep in the spaces available, and this space is available, and you take it. The ceiling above you is the same ceiling you've looked at for 3 weeks of lying in, and then for 14 weeks of nighttime feeds, and it has become as familiar as anything you've ever known. The plaster and the moulding and the small crack in the corner that Charles has promised to have the man in about. He hasn't had the man in about it. You look at the crack. You fall asleep looking at the crack. And centuries from now, somewhere in the dark, someone who's been listening to this will also be tired. The tired that goes all the way down. The tired of a long day and a night that asks things of you, and the weight of living in a body in a world that does not always configure itself around what you need. And they will be lying down, and the weight will be lifting, the way it lifts when you let it, when you stop holding everything up by conscious effort and let the night do what the night does. The city continues, somewhere, but not here. Here it's just the ceiling and the crack and the warmth of the bed and the cold of the room and Eleanor breathing 4 feet away and all of it receding now. The glass pump and the lead shield and Mary Baines and the moral architecture and the books on the shelf and the schedule that was wrong. All of it receding into the past where it belongs, into the enormous past of everything that was hard and has been survived. You've survived it. You are surviving it. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, you will continue to survive it. But not right now. Right now there's just the dark. Warm enough, safe enough, tired enough. Let it come. Let the sleep come the way it came for every woman who sat in that chair in that room in that century, doing the thing that nobody adequately explained and that the medical establishment got wrong in several expensive ways, and that the women themselves figured out slowly in the dark by listening to each other and to their own bodies and to the babies in their arms who were, after all, the clearest possible communicators of what they needed. Let it come. The dark is good. The dark is quiet. The dark is rest, actual rest, the kind that repairs things. Eleanor breathes. You breathe. The fire breathes its last warmth into the room. And the city outside, the city that has been here for centuries and will be here for centuries more, the city that has seen every version of this room and this story, the city that contains everything. The city breathes too in its way, the slow nocturnal breath of a place that is never entirely asleep but is, at 4:30 in the morning in November, as close as it gets. The carters, the watchmen, the bells marking the half hours, the river, all of it fading now, all of it becoming the background, all of it becoming the sound you sleep to, the sound of London being London, constant and indifferent and enormous, carrying on without particular reference to the woman in the bed and the baby in the cradle, and the specific hard-won peace of this specific cold November morning. You've earned this. 14 weeks in, you've earned every minute of this. Good night.